Okay, Richard and Becky. A couple of things that we discovered we talk about in that video with the machine shop operator is the fact that the bearings are worn out. I'm showing this is a rod, here's a piston, and this and there's a bearing surface between the black circle and the red circle. The red circle is the journals on the crankshaft that the bearings run on should only have a few thousandths of an inch clearance between the journal and the bearing. And what we have is one of the journals on the crank, the number 5 journal, is worn way down. So this is exaggerated, but we have a lot of extra clearance in the between the rod bearing and the crank. And now what happens then is when the crank comes up, it is allowing the piston to go too far. In other words, allowing the piston to come up and hit the head. This is the head. I've drawn a block here, an engine block, and the head. So just a flat piece of cast iron for the head. And what's happened, it's allowing the piston to travel too far and hit the head. The other thing we talked about is it seems that the deck, that all the pistons, the number 5 piston was hitting really hard. And I've got, this is either 1 or a 6, but just pretend that's number 5. It's hitting really hard. All the other pistons also seem to be hitting either the gasket between the head, and there'll be a gasket between the head and the block, or they're hitting a spot on the head. So we talked about the block having probably been decked. And what happens is the head can warp over time, especially if the engine overheated, and so can the block. So you can shave the head, and that is make this surface perfectly flat so a gasket will seal off. And then the same procedure on the deck, or on the block, they call it decking the block. And that's just milling the block so it's perfectly level so that a gasket will seal. And so it appears that maybe the block had been decked as well. And I think I even found that in the bills that you sent me. And perhaps they decked it too far, they cut too much off. And so these pistons, all the pistons are actually traveling a little bit. They're not traveling too far, it's just that the block is too short. In the case of number 5, it's traveling too far, and this is why. There's all this space between the crank and the rod bearings, and so it's just throwing the piston way up, and it's hitting hard. That's what you're hearing when you run the engine. So we think that might have been decked too far. We can solve that problem by cutting a little bit off the top of those pistons. The crank is totally damaged. The crank, there's no way to repair the crank. We're going to have to find a used engine and get the crank out of a used engine. We were unable to find any new cranks left over. The other thing that was done wrong, we talked about the thrust bearings. So here's a real simplified crank. Here's a main bearing out here, and here's a main bearing back here, and here's your cranks for your different. Here's the offsets for the different cylinders. And and that's way oversimplified because but anyhow, there's a set of thrust bearings that go at the end of the engine, and they're to keep you have an axial load on the engine, or a thrust load. There's very little thrust load, but the idea is to keep all this centered in the engine block. And there are some thrust bearings that allow the whole thing may move to one side or the other. It's called in play, a few thousandths. But what happened is to put the thrust bearings in, they were oversized. There was absolutely no in play, and so you'll see a ridge ground into one of those thrust bearings, and that's where you had extreme wear on one side of the ridge, and then no wear on the other side. But so that's where a lot of your metal came from, which got into the bearing surfaces, and you see how scratched up all those bearings look. They ought to look like polished. They ought to look like almost like sterling silver. They ought to be polished looking, and they're all. And we showed you the bearings; they're all scratched up, and that's from metal. So, and all that metal's in your transmission as well. So it might take us a couple of days to clean out your transmission. That's $1,200 to clean out your transmission. Well, we can rebuild one for $1,700 in parts, plus the labor of taking the transmission in and out, and or shipping, sending it off. So, I think our best bet is to find a running takeout. We've already started on that quest. As a matter of fact, we may have a running takeout, because otherwise this is going to get real expensive real fast. So we're still putting some prices together and doing a little research on what's the best way to approach your particular engine. And I've got to be off a couple of days. My wife has rotator cuff surgery tomorrow, and then I've got a colonoscopy the next day. But I'll be back. Give me plenty of time to think, and I'll be back in touch with you guys on Thursday, and hopefully with some prices for you, so you can start to make some decisions about how you want to go forward. So anyhow, that's hopefully it'll help you make sense of the videos that we took at the machine shop.